Today is the fourth installment of our Resilience Toolkit and webinar series. Today's topic is crisis management and crisis communication. Melanie Lockwood Herman is back with us again, and she is the Executive Director of the Nonprofit Risk Management Center. She will share more expertise and wisdom with us today. And so we'll go ahead and start with what we usually do, and that would be the promise of community action. So you're welcome to go to the next slide. There we go. Now, since everyone is muted, you are more than welcome to say this behind your screens with me. Community action changes people's lives, embodies the spirit of hope, improves communities, and makes America a better place to live. We care about the entire community, and we are dedicated to helping people help themselves and each other. It's a wonderful way that we start all of our webinars, and it grounds us into who we are and why we do what we do. Okay, next slide. And Melanie, the stage is yours. Thank you again, everyone, for joining, and enjoy.
Thank you so much, Ashley, and thank you, Denise, as well. It's my pleasure to be back to present this session on two topics that are of keen interest to many leaders across the nonprofit sector and the public sector, especially in recent years. As you see on this first slide of mine, you have my contact information, my phone number, and my email address. As always, please know that you are welcome to reach out to me if you have a specific question about any of the things I'm going to talk about today, but also if you want to just brainstorm about a crisis event that's happened in your agency, or one that is imminent, or if you're in the middle of a crisis and you just want a third party, somebody kind of independent of your agency to talk to kind of brainstorm and think through the issue with. I'm certainly a resource to you, and there is no charge for that support. And that's part of what we call risk help, which is available to all community action leaders across the country at no charge, because the National Community Action Partnership has purchased what we call an affiliate membership with my organization, the Nonprofit Risk Management Center. So many of you have viewed and used some of the resources we've developed for community action. I just like to remind everyone that the Nonprofit Risk Management Center is a nonprofit, and our mission is to help nonprofit leadership teams, both management teams and governing teams, think about risk differently and approach risk with confidence so that hopefully their organizations can take more risk to achieve their missions. So we're not about eliminating risk, right? We think that that's something that's impossible to do. We're about getting and becoming more confident with the risks you face and the risks you embrace so that you can take more risk in the long run. So that's a little bit about us. So in terms of today's program, I broke it down into 4 topics. I want to start with a few definitions. So I'll share some definitions of the term crisis and also crisis communications. And then I want to talk about strategies to build crisis resilience. So that word resilience has been a commonly used term in the last year and a half. Since the pandemic began. Many of us have been focused on how do we make our organizations more resilient. Many of us have also been thinking about how do we become, as individuals, more resilient. So I want to talk about this idea of crisis resilience. What does that mean? And then I want to shift a little bit and talk about crisis communications. And the theme for this part of the presentation is how to stay on message. Because the truth is that in a crisis, it's really easy to get off track. It's really easy to become distracted by everything that's happening around you. And so one of the most important things we want to do in a crisis is really stay on message and stay on point and stay on track. So I want to share some tips for doing that. And then, as with all of my webinars and workshops for community action audiences, I'd like to end with some final tips and takeaways. And what you'll see in this section are some things that have inspired me as I've been doing a lot of reading and a lot of reflecting during the pandemic. And I hope that some of the material that I share in this final section will be inspiring to you as well. And perhaps you'll want to share it with others in your agency. So let's go ahead and get started with what is a crisis? What does that word crisis mean? And what is crisis communications? So I always find that it's helpful to define terms before you start explaining how and what and why. So let's go ahead and look at a few definitions. So this is from a book that I read many, many years ago. It was part of what the Harvard Business Press calls its Pocket Mentor series. And it was a series of publications that were very slim in format, so small that you could kind of tuck them in the pocket of a business suit. And in that book, they defined crisis in the following way. They said that a crisis is sudden or evolving, is a change that results in an urgent problem that must be addressed immediately. So a crisis is a change, something different, and it can either happen all at once or it can evolve. It can kind of snowball or happen over time. But the key things to remember about this definition are that a crisis is an urgent problem that must be addressed immediately. So it's not something we can put off. So if you're thinking about a crisis event in your organization, but you're reflecting on it and thinking, well, I can worry about that next month, or maybe later in the fiscal year, we'll work on that. It's not really a crisis, right? A crisis demands your immediate attention. You need to work on it and do something about it right away. So I think this definition kind of works. I like this definition. And the second definition is from Sage Publications. And in this instance, the authors have defined what they call an organizational crisis. And I like the terms they use, and I've kind of highlighted some of the themes in this definition. They say that an organizational crisis is a specific, unexpected, and non-routine event or series of events that creates high levels of uncertainty and simultaneously present an organization with both opportunities and threats to its high priority goals. So this is a long definition. It's probably one that's more difficult to memorize than the definition from the Harvard Business Press Pocket Mentor publication. But I like this definition as well. I like the fact that it reminds us that a crisis is generally a surprise. It's not something that we were expecting. It's a threat, something that could cause lots of difficulty and challenges for our organization. And it reminds us that we need to respond in a short amount of time, right? So going back to that other definition, immediately. We need to jump on it. We need to do something right away. We can't put this off. But I also like the fact that this definition highlights the word opportunities, or reminds us that with every crisis event, with every downside risk, in fact, there are generally some silver linings. And I know for some of you that have faced some terrible circumstances during COVID-19 and the loss of loved ones, the loss of colleagues, sometimes it's hard to reflect on the silver linings. But typically there are silver linings with every crisis event, with every risk event. So I encourage you to give yourself space and give yourself permission to think about those silver linings. Identify, what did you learn? How can you make your agency stronger and more resilient in the future? So let's go ahead and look at the next definition, which is, what is a crisis communications plan? Well, a crisis communications plan is a plan that outlines and explains a whole host of things, right? Including who should speak and who shouldn't speak, materials that need to be produced and available, who should be involved in the process, right? Who's on the crisis communications team, who you're going to keep in the loop, so who you're informing about what's happening during a crisis. Another item that's often in a crisis communications plan would be a telephone directory with contact information. So you're not scrambling to try to find out, how do I reach so-and-so and so-and-so? You've got those names and numbers available. I would also encourage you to put draft messages, almost templated messages that can be tweaked in your crisis communications plan, and additional points of contact. I'm going to go back. So we jumped to what is in a crisis communications plan, but let's talk about what is crisis communications. What do we mean by this term? So I've chosen 3 different definitions to share with you. And as you can see, I'm someone who tends to look for multiple definitions to really understand what I'm talking about and what I'm teaching, instead of just gravitating to one definition. And it's a way of reminding myself that there are many different ways to see something, many different ways to understand a concept. So on Wikipedia, the definition of crisis communications is a subspecialty of the public relations profession. And I found that interesting because I guess my gut feeling was that crisis communications is kind of a core discipline in an organization. It's something that every organization needs to be able to do because we could all face a crisis. But I never really thought of it as part of public relations before because many nonprofits don't have a public relations function, right? And then a technology company by the name of Rock Dove Solutions says that crisis communications is a collection of technologies and systems that help an organization communicate during an emergency situation. So if you're a systems provider or a technology company, you're kind of thinking about equipment, right? The ability to reach a lot of people all at once, to notify them about what's happening in a crisis. And that's a little bit different than public relations, right? So a different kind of lens through which to see this discipline. And then the last definition is from the Business Dictionary, and it's the effort taken by a company to communicate with the public when an unexpected event occurs that could have a negative impact on the company's reputation. So I think this last definition is interesting because it reminds us that generally speaking, when an organization is facing a crisis, there's the potential for reputation harm, that very few organizations would characterize an event where everything's coming up roses and it all seems very positive and there's lots of excitement, right? Very few of us would characterize that as a crisis. So a crisis typically has this potential for harm to reputation, the potential for harm to individuals, the potential for damage to your organization. All right, let's keep going. So what about your mission? One of the things that I realized as I was looking through these definitions, particularly the definitions of crisis communications, was that there really was no reference to mission. And as Ashley reminded us in the promise at the beginning of the session, community action agencies are mission-driven organizations, and obviously nonprofits across the country are also mission-driven organizations. So what I tried to do was take these definitions and infuse mission into them. So I came up with these two definitions to share. The first is that crisis communications is mission-focused messaging and dialogue with vital stakeholders during a crisis. So just a reminder, if you're running a public or a nonprofit community action agency, you don't have shareholders, but you do have stakeholders. And we tend to have stakeholders that are so important to our success. So it's all about communicating to your stakeholders and reminding ourselves that it's mission-focused messaging, that if we simply deliver messages that have nothing to do with our mission or don't remind those stakeholder audiences of the mission of our organization, we've really fallen down on our responsibility to communicate effectively during a crisis. And then my second definition is crisis communications is informing your community, and that word community takes us right back to the promise of community action, with mission-focused messaging, inspiring confidence and comfort in times of crisis. So I like this definition because it reminds us that when we're conducting crisis communications, when we're doing a good job communicating during a crisis event, we want to inspire confidence in the organization. We want the people that are hearing those messages to feel that we care and that we're doing the right thing and we're taking care of business and we're focused on our mission and we're doing what's right in those circumstances. But we also want to provide some comfort when people are worried, when people are concerned, when they're afraid and fearful. So I think there's a lot we're trying to accomplish in crisis communications, and it's not easy to do, but I hope the rest of the program today will be helpful as you think about whether your organization is really prepared to manage through a crisis, manage through your next crisis, and communicate effectively to all of the stakeholder groups that are depending on you for services and that are depending on you for, again, that comfort and that confidence. So let's shift to the second topic, which is strategies to build crisis resilience. So my first strategy is to prepare for impacts and not events. And this may sound counterintuitive to many of you who have kind of worked on plans to deal with the pandemic or to deal with a severe weather event, to deal with a power outage, to perhaps cope with or respond to an act of workplace violence. So we're almost trained in the risk management discipline and certainly in the crisis management discipline to imagine all the different types of events that could happen to our agencies and come up with plans to cope with all of them. The problem with this approach, which many organizations have used, is that there are so many different things that could happen that could cause a crisis. If you take the time to come up with a separate plan, a distinct plan for each type of crisis event, the risk is that you'll never finish. You'll never end up with full plans for all of those events because the list is too long. And at the beginning of the pandemic, I just happened to have an organization that I was working with. I had their business continuity plan sitting on my desk. And I pulled it out. I think I was filing it, right? I was getting ready to kind of put it away in a file. And I was flipping through it and noticed that in the table of contents, they actually had a pandemic listed in their table of contents as a potential source of an interruption or a crisis for their agency. And I thought, this is amazing. A pandemic is listed in the table of contents. So I thought, this is incredible. This is an organization that's thought about a lot of different events, including pandemic. I wonder what their plans were to deal with a global pandemic now that we're in one. And as I flipped through the business continuity plan, I noticed that the pandemic was never mentioned ever again. So they had created this long list of events from earthquake to workplace violence, and then, of course, including pandemic. And the subsequent pages of the plan had specific steps and strategies, but they ran out of time. They never got to thinking about what would we do if there were a pandemic. So again, this is going to feel a little bit counterintuitive, but let me explain kind of the alternative to focusing on events, right? So here's a list of some of the events that many organizations try to plan for, right? Hurricane, tornado, workplace violence, global pandemic, fraud, abuse, death of a vital team member, right? A tragic accident. So the list can go on and on. If you've got a good imagination, you can come up with a lot of different crisis events. Now, I want you to think a little bit about what are the potential impacts on your agency should these events occur. And so I've listed on the left-hand side of this slide some of those crisis impacts. Well, one of the impacts we're likely to experience is we might have difficulty reaching people, right? Individuals that we need to help deliver services are not available. We might wind up in costly litigation. Someone might sue our agencies alleging that we've been negligent in handling a particular event or set of circumstances. We might lose funding, right? A funding source may be unable to continue supporting us or may be unhappy with how we handle the event. We might find it difficult to meet certain basic expenses. Many organizations during the past year and a half during the pandemic found it difficult to pay some of their bills because they found that certain revenue streams were cut off. They weren't able to deliver services normally, and so the money that typically comes into the agency from those services stopped flowing, and as a result, it became difficult to pay expenses. And then many agencies found that it was simply impossible to deliver some core services. And then we also experienced sometimes negative media scrutiny during a crisis. So these are some of the crisis impacts. And then over on the right-hand side of the slide, I have some crisis events. Well, I think if you were to draw lines from one side of the slide to the other, you'd see that many of these impacts are potentially relevant to multiple crisis events. So to me, I think it's a bit more efficient to start thinking about impacts and start planning for impacts. You know, how would we cope with the possibility that we might not be able to reach everybody that we need to reach, to tell them that we're closed, to tell them that our services have been cut back, to tell them that we're not able to provide support as they are accustomed to receiving for the next week, for the next month, and so forth. I feel like if you start focusing more on impacts, you've got a shorter to-do list than if you try to focus on crisis events, where you're going to have a lot of redundancy coming up with a plan for each of these events. So that's the first strategy that I wanted to share to inspire you to try to build resilience. Focus on impacts instead of events, and think about those impacts on your agency. And I'm sure you can come up with a longer list. and think about what you'll do now to kind of ready your agency to cope with those impacts. So my second strategy to build crisis resilience is to pay obsessive focus to near misses. And there's been some really interesting research on the topic of failure, much of it done by Professor Amy Edmondson, who teaches at the Harvard Business School and has written some wonderful articles and books about the topic of psychological safety. But Amy Edmondson has written that, the research shows us time and time again that many crisis events don't come out of the blue and shouldn't be a complete surprise to leaders of organizations because they're preceded by near misses, things that almost happened, that nearly happened, mistakes that almost caused a crisis, but somehow an organization was able to kind of move out of the way. And unfortunately, many near miss events are characterized as successes, right? We almost had a disaster, but we didn't. So we kind of pat ourselves on the back and we become almost self-congratulatory that we didn't face the crisis. And what Professor Edmondson and others who do research in this area remind us to do is, instead of treating a near miss as a success, we need to treat a near miss as a failure and as an incredible opportunity to learn, as a chance to really take a second look and figure out, how did this happen? Why did this happen? So as you think about near misses and failures and those oops kind of moments in your organization's history, I want to encourage you to think about, what events or circumstances could have been a crisis. Maybe you did a great kind of after action review, or you reflected and paused after a near miss. But if you're like me, you probably moved on pretty quickly to the next thing and just thanked your lucky stars. So take some time to think about, have there been events or circumstances that could have been a crisis? In what ways have we been extraordinarily lucky? As you look back on the last 18 months, in what ways was your agency extraordinarily lucky? And what have we been dead wrong about, right? What have we been dead wrong about? We thought things would turn out in a certain way, but they turned out quite differently. When you ask these kind of reflective or self-reflective questions, I think you're kind of getting at some of those near misses that offer kind of fertile opportunities to learn and to grow and to build resilience in your agency. So my third strategy is to tap the power of negative thinking. For those of you who've worked with me in the past and who know me or read the risky news that we publish, you may recall that I tend to be an optimist. I tend to be optimistic about everything. But I think sometimes allowing ourselves to engage in a little bit of negative thinking can be really helpful to build future resilience and to kind of build that resilience muscle. And so here's how I would approach that. When you tap the power of negative thinking, you're starting with, if this happens, this is what we'll do. And you could start with just, what's the worst thing that could happen? What's the worst that could happen? And you could ask this generally about your agency. What's the worst thing that could happen to this agency at this particular point in our history? What's the absolute worst thing? Or you could ask, what's the worst thing that could happen in this particular area of operations? So let's say that you've decided to invest in and expand a particular line of services. So perhaps it's transportation. Perhaps it's weatherization. It could really be anything that you do. It may be your Head Start program, your after school program, and so forth. So if you were to take this step, make this decision to invest in this area of service delivery and really expand, what's the worst that could happen, right? And after you ask that question, then you want to ask, and then what? And then what next, right? And as you ask these kind of reflective questions, you start to get at some of the things that could happen and some of the steps and strategies or decisions you can make now to bolster or fortify or strengthen your approach to delivering those services, right? Fill in some of those gaps, address some of the holes, right? Reduce the likelihood that that worst thing could happen. So a colleague of mine from a New York-based nonprofit told me some years ago that in her agency, we started talking about risk management. We happened to be sitting together at an event that was held in Washington, D.C., and she saw my name tag, and so she asked me about, the work that the Nonprofit Risk Management Center does. And I asked her about risk management in her organization, and she said, at my organization, we do risk management. And she said, we're really committed to risk management, but we don't call it risk management. She said, we came up with something different, an alternative. We felt that talking about risk would be kind of off-putting to members of our team. So she said, we decided to convene our teams, their functional and departmental teams in our agency, and each team was asked to articulate their top goals. What are the top priorities, strategic priorities, priority goals, objectives that your team is trying to achieve this year. And she said, we encourage them to only come up with 1, 2, or maybe 3, but just limit it to what's the number one thing you're trying to do? What are the top 3 goals? And then she said, we asked each team to identify never ever events. And the way she described it is a never ever event is something that can never happen. If it happens, that goal will be impossible to achieve. And so what she told me was that it helped the teams really focus on things that were meaningful rather than kind of abstract risks, abstract crisis events that may never happen. She said they started by focusing on the things that are most important to their team this year or over the next 3 years. And then they identified the never ever events, those things that could never ever happen, or those important goals and objectives will not be achieved. And she said, after they've identified those never ever events, then they started brainstorming, what do we need to do right now to prevent those never ever events from happening? And in essence, the entire exercise was all about building resilience, building kind of a supportive structure around those key objectives and goals. So just a different way to approach tapping the power of negative thinking. So here's another tool. It's just a simple chart that I created, and it's the idea of making a list of the worst things that could happen to your organization, the absolute worst things that could happen to your organization. You could also do a worst things that could happen to our department or a function or a program that you're leading. So you fill in the first column with the 5 worst things, and then you break it down and you ask, what will we do if that thing happens, right? What will we do if that thing happens? And then the final column is, what will we do now? Is there anything we can do now to either prevent that worst thing from happening or get us ready, right? Help us prepare, build resilience so we'll be able to survive that worst thing if it does happen, right? So this is a super simple chart, and you could use this in a management team meeting. You could use this in a board meeting to have the board kind of brainstorm around what are the worst things that could happen to the organization. Or you could ask the board to identify what are the worst things that could happen with respect to governance practices, with respect to the way we govern, the way we lead this organization. So you can use this kind of tool in many different settings to kind of start with thinking about these worst things, those negative thoughts, and then shift right away into what do we do? What do we do when it happens, if it does happen, and what do we do right now? So my 4th strategy in terms of building resilience to survive a crisis, to manage through a crisis successfully, is to address the internal sources of a future crisis. So many of you have already realized this and recognized this in your own agencies, that sometimes a future crisis, the seeds of a future crisis are being sown right now, that there's something happening in your agency that could lead to a future crisis. And this really requires a lot of, reflection and thought and humility, kind of acknowledging that everything is not perfect and things could go off the rails. And I've just given you a few examples of potential future crisis events that are being sown now, where there are seeds or evidence that crisis could happen in the future. I work with a lot of teams across many different types of nonprofits, obviously not just community action agencies, but across the diverse nonprofit sector. And I often see lack of alignment. I see teams engaged in power struggles, right? About which function, which program is most important, which will get the most money and resources, which will get additional FTEs in the upcoming budget cycle. So that can turn into a crisis. Where we have so many priorities in an agency and it isn't clear what the top priorities are, we tend to use up all the resources that are available, right? And sometimes we don't end up delivering services in the high quality fashion that we want to because we're stretched too thin. And then some organizations, frankly, have an unsustainable business model where you can see that demand is changing, but you're continuing to offer services at the same level that you offered those services years ago, even though the writing is on the wall. So there are all sorts of things that could be happening in an agency that are sending you kind of signs, right? This is the universe sending you signs that you need to make some changes, and that without change, a crisis could be in the offing. So I would encourage you to ask, what's happening beneath the surface here that could trigger a future crisis? What's going on right now in our agency that maybe we're not so comfortable talking about, but could evolve into a crisis? And then the corresponding question is, what can we do about it? What should we do about it? What should I be thinking about as a leader and taking action on today to prevent that future crisis from occurring? So take time to address the internal sources of a future crisis. Now I want to shift gears and talk about how to stay on message during a crisis. So this next part is all about crisis communications. So the first thing I want to point out is that there are different types of crisis or risk communications. And this, the content from this slide is from Peter Sandman and Jody Leonard, who wrote about these three types. They say that one category of crisis or risk communication is what they call precaution advocacy. And this is where we're alerting people to hazards, right? So it's urgent, right? We need to draw their attention to certain information, but we're basically saying, watch out, take care, right? A second type of crisis or risk communication is what they call outrage management, which is when we're trying to communicate, we need you to calm down. We need to reassure you. Things are going to be okay. Please don't worry. To some extent, a lot of us have been doing this in recent months as we talk about vaccinations for COVID-19. We've been trying to encourage people to learn as much as they can and recognize and accept, that the high degree of safety of these vaccinations. And when we're encouraging people to become vaccinated, we're sharing information, available information from public health sources about the safety of the vaccine. And then the third type of risk communication is what they call kind of the pure crisis communication, which is when we reassure stakeholders that we can get through this together, that we want to guide you through serious hazards, knowing that you're probably worried and upset and concerned and uncertain. And so this is kind of that pure crisis communication. So they describe this as the three different categories of risk communication. I kind of think there's subsets of crisis communications as well, with the general being this third category, being reassuring, inspiring confidence in what your agency is doing. But there are instances in crisis communications where we are really trying to encourage people to watch out and take care. We're trying to alert them to what's happening. And there are other instances where we're trying to encourage them to calm down and feel reassured. So as we think about how to stay on message during a crisis, I want to encourage you to simplify your message. And many of you have heard this rule, the rule of three, that if you're trying to communicate something important, if you're trying to explain something, stick to no more than 3 messages, right? Don't try to cover too much. Every one of us has read a memo or received an email from somebody that we're supposed to be paying attention to, where it's just so convoluted and it has so many messages that we can't remember, what am I supposed to be paying attention to? What's the most important thing here? So the rule of 3 is a good one. So if you're communicating during a crisis, when nerves are on edge, when people are fearful and worried, and there's lots of uncertainty, I think that rule of 3 can serve you well. So the example here is, we care, right? We care about you. And we're here. So we saw that during the pandemic, many agencies pushing out messages that basically said, we care and we're here to help, right? We're still open. We may be working remotely and our office hours have changed and some of our locations are closed, but we're here. And then I love this third message in this example. Here's how you can help, right? It's such a great way to close any sort of crisis communications piece by saying, this is what we need from you, right? And it may be, we need you to be patient, right? The demand is really high, so we might not be able to get to you as quickly as we'd like to. Or we could really use your volunteer service. If you have some time and can come help us, that would be wonderful. Or we need financial donations. So again, we care in a really important way to lead any crisis communications message, to kind of share with the community your concern for what's happening. We're here, right? We're working hard to get through this crisis, and then this is how you can help. So again, this is just an example of simplifying a message to 3 key points, but I think this structure can work in a lot of crisis communications pieces. As you start to draft crisis communications messages and templates and narratives or scripts, I want you to remember who, what, and how. So I've made this grid to just remind me as I'm working through these messages and trying to draft messages, some of the important things I need to cover. So I definitely need to think about who needs to hear from me? Who am I communicating with? I love using a grid like this in PowerPoint or Word or Excel to just remind me to tick off a lot of boxes, right? So in this example, I've identified clients may need to hear from me, staff need to hear from me, donors, funders of the agency need to hear from me, and maybe the general public, maybe the media, right? Maybe there's a really wide audience, this catch-all audience. So what do they need to hear? Well, the what they need to hear is probably going to be different if I'm a client versus a staff member or a donor, right? Or the media, right? So a client might want to know whether you're open and what services are available and what services have been put on hold. Whereas your staff want to know, is it safe to come to work? Are you flexible? Can I change up my hours this week because of things I'm facing, right? Is my job safe, right? Do I still have a job, right? Whereas a donor may want to hear, how can we help? And of course, the media and the general public want to hear, how is this community action agency answering the call, right? How is this agency responding to this crisis? So I want you to focus on what, who and what, and then I also want you to focus on the how, right? And that's how you're going to reach all of these different audiences with these kind of nuanced messages, right? It's not the same message. It's a different message depending on who you're trying to reach. So typically with clients, you'll probably use many different methods. With staff, you're going to use multiple methods as well. And with donors, I would suggest you pick up the phone and call them. If you have key donors or funders of your agency, I wouldn't rely on email. I wouldn't send them a text message. I would pick up the phone and call them. You know, it's amazing in this digital age, how people really love getting a phone call. And I've had just in my own experience, when I pick up the phone to call somebody, I often hear, thank you for calling. It's so nice to hear your voice. It's so nice to get a call. I get lots of emails and lots of text messages, and I even get robocalls, but very few people actually call me. And then with the general audience, with the media, with the general public, you're certainly going to use your website as a way to get information out there. You may make phone calls and have those one-on-one conversations with representatives of the media, and you may issue press releases. So there are lots of different methods. There are lots of different messages, and there are many different stakeholder groups. I encourage you to try to keep track of it all. And one way to do that is by just using a kind of a cheat sheet, a grid, such as what I'm showing you on this slide. I would also encourage you, as you're thinking about formulating messages to these various stakeholder groups and thinking about what you're going to say and how you're going to deliver that message, I would encourage you to break down your communications pieces in a crisis to at least 2 different categories, 2 different major categories. So the first category is all about the event, right? What's happening? What's happening? What do you know about what's happening, right? So I've used COVID-19 as an example on this slide. But then you also want to make sure that you're covering all about you. So make sure you're talking about what it is your agency is in business to do, the mission of your community action agency, who you serve. So don't limit your crisis communications pieces to just the event specific information. You want to make sure that you're also including all about you. And some of you are thinking about this already. The all about you piece is something you can write now. You don't have to wait until a crisis hits to write that information about your agency. So you can work on that in advance. This is a tip from a faculty member at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology by the name of Hal Gregerson, and he's written a terrific book called Questions Are the Answer. And I really enjoyed reading this book last year because it just reminded me that in so many instances, leaders of organizations feel that they need to be the expert. They need to have all the answers. And in a crisis, it can feel overwhelming. So many people want answers. They want to know what you're doing and can you help them? But I think in a crisis, we also need to reflect on the fact that we don't have all the answers. And in many cases, we have a lot of questions. And so I want to just encourage you to ask not only your staff, but your clientele, what do you need to feel safe or safer, right? Often in leadership, we make a lot of assumptions or presumptions. We presume that we need to figure things out. And many organizations are struggling right now trying to figure out how can we reopen our offices safely? And they keep pushing out messages to staff that will let you know as soon as we know when we can open. And I just think that in some ways I understand that. I understand that pressure on a leader to figure things out and have kind of a definitive plan and feel confident about the plan. But I just want to remind you that it's okay to ask people, what do you think we should do? What do you need? What does safe mean to you? And Hal Gregerson in his terrific book just reminds us to immerse ourselves in situations where we feel less right, less comfortable, and that we'll have more questions when we do that. So as we think about the details of crisis communications messages, as we think about transparency, I want to remind you that in any crisis communications piece, you want to make sure you're providing enough detail to be informative without getting bogged down in unnecessary minutia, right? We don't want to confuse people when we're communicating during a crisis. We also want to remind ourselves of the importance of transparency. And sometimes we use transparency in the nonprofit and in the public sectors. We use it just kind of rolls off our tongues that we want to be transparent or that we are transparent. Sometimes we're not as transparent as we say we are, and we're holding back a lot of information. So I would encourage you to think about, what information am I holding back? What am I not telling people? What might they want to know? Not just what am I comfortable sharing, but what might they want to know? And why aren't I sharing that? What makes me uncomfortable about sharing that? And there will always be some information that you can't share in a crisis, but I think sometimes we err on the side of holding too much back and almost fooling ourselves into thinking we're being transparent. So really kind of poke at that issue of transparency. And whenever you're communicating during a crisis, whatever that forum is, whatever the setting is, make sure that you're providing an opportunity to ask questions. If you've ever seen somebody communicating in a crisis, a press conference where the spokesperson, right, it could be for a corporation, it could be for a public entity, that spokesperson gets up at the podium and they make an announcement, they read a statement, and then they say, we're not taking any questions, and then they leave. That final element of that press conference is so disheartening, is so confusing. Why is it they're not taking any questions, right? And it really starts to cause us to question whether we can trust that person who's just made the announcement, right? They got up at the podium, they called a press conference, they read a statement, and then they refused to take questions. So make sure whatever you're doing, whether it's sending out an announcement on your website, if it's a recorded message that you play about changes in circumstances, that you give people an outlet, a place where they can ask questions. And of course, make sure you're listening and tuning into the questions that you receive. A really, really important part of crisis communications is making sure you know who your spokesperson is, right? Who is the person or who are the people who are authorized to speak on behalf of your agency? And this person should ideally be trained for that role, really be comfortable looking into the camera and answering questions on the fly, right, from individuals who are concerned about what's happening. In many agencies, the spokesperson, the official spokesperson, is the chief executive officer of the agency, but in some cases, that person is not well suited to be the spokesperson. If you are the CEO of your community action agency, I hope you know already whether you are a good spokesperson. You know, some of us are great leaders and managers, but when put on the spot, when under pressure, we might not perform as well. We might not be as comfortable. Instead of reassuring people that we're talking to, we may end up causing folks to be more nervous, right? Because it's obvious that we're nervous. So sometimes it's better to have somebody else serve as your spokesperson. Now, the last point I want to make on this slide is that you want to make sure that anybody in your agency who is not your spokesperson knows they are not your spokesperson, so they don't inadvertently raise their hand and agree to give a media interview and represent your agency when really they're not trained and they are not the official spokesperson. So you have to tell people not only when they are the spokesperson and make sure they understand their role, but you need everybody else to understand that they are not the official spokesperson. And I've seen that mistake made in a number of agencies. So this is some tips, 3 tips from learning and development professionals from an article called Learning and Development Professionals Can Lead Through the Pandemic. And I thought this was interesting, these tips, this idea that we need to keep communication lines open. Even though we're busy, even though we're facing a crisis and we're facing some challenges, we need to remember that communicating is vitally important. We can't just keep our heads down and do the work. We have to tell people what we're doing. We need to lead with empathy and show empathy and understanding to others and recognizing that we can never understand what it feels like to be in somebody else's shoes. We need to acknowledge fear and worry and all of those emotions that surround a crisis and that crop up during a crisis. And we need to be transparent, as I said before, and recognize and even acknowledge we don't have all the answers. And when we don't have the answers, it's okay to say so. We don't know. We don't know the answer to that. I'll do my best to get back to you is a perfectly acceptable answer. So, or response to a question about something where you just don't have the facts. You don't have that information that individual wants. So this next slide has what I'm calling tips for surviving the spotlight. If you don't know, say so. If it's feasible to find out, try to find out and get back to that individual. Try to be as sincere and compassionate as you possibly can. One of the mistakes I've seen in crisis communications in the nonprofit sector is a tendency for leaders to say something about, whether it's a death or an injury or a terrible accident, if it happened at some adjacent organization, so maybe it happened at another community action agency, or maybe it happened at another organization in your block or in your town or in your community, I've seen leaders say, but nobody was hurt here, right? That incident didn't affect us. Unfortunately, when you say something like that, what it suggests is kind of lack of compassion for the people who were injured, for those who were killed, for the organization that lost its headquarters building due to some horrible, explosion or workplace violence or whatever happened. So just be very careful that you don't, quickly add this idea that nobody got hurt here. It was all over there in someone else's organization or backyard. So I think it's really, what that does is it just kind of extracts all that sincerity and compassion out of the message that you're delivering. I would also encourage you to try to accommodate any reasonable requests. Often members of the media who are doing a story about the crisis want to do the story right in front of where the crisis happened. So they want to do it in your backyard. They want to do it in front of your building. And it's best to try to accommodate those requests and really understand that that backdrop provides context for the story. And then it's so important to admit when a mistake has been made. It's really the first step in terms of reestablishing credibility. Some additional tips. It's helpful, I think, to remind ourselves that if we want to stay on message when we're communicating during a crisis, we want to demonstrate care. We want to show commitment. We certainly want to be consistent, right? We want to get our own story straight and make sure that we really are not sending mixed messages to whoever the audience is. We want to be coherent, right? We want to be clear, right? So we want to choose coherence and clarity as guideposts when we're drafting messages. So I find these 5 C's really helpful. And as you're reviewing, as you're editing, proofreading your messages, whether they're going to be published on your website, whether they're going to be read at a press conference, at a town hall meeting, I would encourage you to pick somebody on your team to run through that final draft and tick off these boxes. Does this message kind of exude care? Does it really show that we're committed? Is it consistent with what we've said before? And if not, have we explained why we've changed our position? Is it clear? Is it coherent? So do a final run through to check that you've met these 5 C's. All right, I want to close with some final tips and takeaways. There was a terrific article in the Harvard Business Review last year called Real Leaders Are Forged in Crisis. And in the article, the author says that leaders who are leading through a crisis need to provide both brutal honesty and credible hope. And I thought it was an interesting juxtaposition of these two things, that we need to be honest. We can't sugarcoat things. We need to explain that things are difficult, that something terrible has happened in some cases. But we need to make sure that we're also offering hope that we can get through this together. So I thought this is a great sentiment and reminder, kind of these twin pillars of managing through a crisis or providing leadership in a crisis. I also want to encourage you to remember to be patient and forgiving. You know, during a crisis, people make mistakes. There are slip-ups. And sometimes we act in haste. Sometimes so many things are running through our heads that we forget something, right? We miss something. And we need to be patient and forgiving with others, those on our teams, but also with ourselves when we make those mistakes. So it's just a really important reminder during a crisis, so much is happening that it's very easy to get tripped up and to make mistakes and to skip steps. But ultimately, we need to forgive ourselves so we can move on and learn from that experience. Another tip from that article, Real Leaders Are Forged in Crisis, is about tending to energy and emotion. And the author reminds us that a crisis event takes a toll on everybody. And, it's exhausting to survive and thrive in the middle of a crisis and to come out of a crisis. And particularly during the pandemic, many people have lost loved ones, and that's a devastating consequence. And she says that as you lead through any crisis, you need to keep your finger on the pulse of everyone's energy and emotions and respond as needed. So just a really important reminder that as leaders, we need to tend to energy and emotion. It's not just about giving people assignments and work to do and keeping them busy. It's also about showing that we care. And then I also wanted to suggest that you think about how you're creating a buffer. And again, this is all about building resilience so that you can survive the next crisis and you can communicate effectively in the next crisis. I do think buffer zones and the concept of a buffer is really powerful. It's kind of a core tenet of both risk management and crisis management. In his book, Essentialism, the author, Greg McCown, says, the only thing we can expect with any great certainty is the unexpected. And he says, so we can either wait for the moment to happen and react in the moment, which is what many of us do, right? Or we can prepare. And he says the essence of preparation is creating a buffer, right? Giving ourselves a little bit of time or a little bit of runway to deal with the crisis. And so I've got a list of buffer zones that you can create in your organization starting right away. If you haven't already done these things, I encourage you to think about them. The first is make sure you're doing a lot of cross-training, right? Cross-training is where more than one person knows how to do something that's really important. Think back to the pandemic. Was there anything where somebody who was the only person who knew how to do something was out? They were out sick, or they were out caring for a loved one. Backup plans, right? Do you have backup plans for everything that's really important in your agency? Do you have flexibility? Do you build it into everything you do, right? And an example here is a contract. Every contract you sign should have some sort of escape hatch that if circumstances arise such that you can't do this anymore, you can't live up to the contract, how will you get out of it? and make sure that you've got reasonable deadlines for everything you undertake in your agency. Make sure that you adopt reasonable deadlines. And I'm so grateful for my team that constantly reminds me that, I tend to pick these really short time frames and overly ambitious time frames. And they're always reminding me about the planning fallacy. And the planning fallacy is a cognitive bias that reminds us that we often underestimate the amount of time it takes to do something. And so when you remind yourself of this fallacy, of this bias, you give yourself a little bit of a buffer. So that is the end of the content that I wanted to share today on crisis management and crisis communications. I'm going to turn it back over to Denise for the closing. Just once again, feel free to reach out to me if you have questions about anything I've talked about today, or really any risk management topic, and you'll see that my phone number and email address are on this slide.
Well, thank you, Melanie. I do have a comment in the chat. Someone's wanting to comment and they would like me to unmute them. Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay. Connie, just bear with me a moment. I'm going to try to find you here. Okay, Connie, go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon, Melanie. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. I'm Connie Fahim. I'm with the Ocean Ink Community Action Agency. We're in southern New Jersey. I just want to start by saying, first of all, this was a very good presentation. And also I want to let you know, I used to previously, prior to working for the Community Action Agency Network for over 20 years, I worked at General Public Utilities. And I was actually part of the communications department, and as part of the 3 Mile Island accident, we were part of the issue that had took place, and I was actually trained after the accident occurred. And the reason that they beefed up their communications department was essentially the reasons were the things that you were talking about. Some of the issues that came out as a result of the 3 Mile Island accident was folks didn't have confidence in the organization, as you talked about. There were a lot of issues going on around the Harrisburg area. Inform the community with focused information, and also the outrage management you spoke of, the calming down, reassuring people. The issue really bolted down to, and the reason they had to re-educate the communications department was that the very thing you spoke about in crisis communication is getting the correct spokesperson. General Public Utilities decided to have engineers speak on behalf of what was going on, and they really didn't have the correct spokesperson at the time to talk about the issues, to calm the public down. And as you recall, this happened back in about 1979. So these issues took place, and many of the public, and at the time Jimmy Carter was president, and many the governor themselves, there was so much confusion going on. So as I listened to you talk, in the very end, what I saw is getting the correct spokesperson as a result of what I saw in my education to communications is the exact thing that needs to happen. And that was the problem at 3 Mile Island. And as a result, they were fined to the tune of like 82 million and quite a few other dollars. And unfortunately, as you talked about the plan, the separation, the actually separate plan to deal with this, it was the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that mandated the plan as a result of what happened with 3 Mile Island. So I was really happy to hear everything you were talking about, and everything you spoke about was exactly what I was trained on the aftermath of the 3 Mile Island accident. So thank you very much.
Sure, thank you.
All right, excellent. Thank you for that. All right, well, thank you so much, Melanie, for your excellent and valuable information for us today, and also to those who are able to attend. We're going to go ahead and move into our upcoming opportunities, which the first you see on your screen. The National Partnership is promoting a leadership, coaching, and technical assistance opportunity, and we encourage executive directors and other leaders to sign up at the link I entered into the chat. Let's see if it's still there. There you go. And next screen, please. And our next webinar is going to be the 5th in the series that Melanie has been presenting. It's Ready or Not, Creating Practical Action-Oriented Readiness Plans. That will take place on June 17th. And next slide. July 15th is her 6th in the series, Ready to Serve, How to Build and Equip a Crisis-Ready Response Team. And I believe that closes it out for the day. We thank you so much for attending for us. As a reminder, we do want to hear from you. Please complete the quick survey that opens up in your browser at the close of the webinar. Slides and recording will be sent to all the registrants within 2 to 3 days of the live event, and we'll also post them to the partnership website. Thank you all for attending, and you have a great afternoon.